Powerless by Jacqueline. Prologue. When Hannah was 8 and Maria was 10, Hannah heard her sister scream in the woods. "Maria?" Hannah called, scrambling out of the long midsummer grass where she had been hiding, waiting for Maria to find her. Maria screamed again, and Hannah bolted down the narrow dirt path, ducking under the low-hanging branches and trying not to tumble when her ankles tangled in the undergrowth. Sedovia was abundant with greenery in the summer branches, heavy with leaves and crawling plants bursting forth after lying dormant under the snow for 6 months. Beautiful to look at, but another obstacle in Hannah's way. Hannah followed the sound of Maria's shouts and stumbled into the small clearing with a bonfire at its center and no one to be seen. She frowned at the sight. Midsummer's Day was a time for family and friends, and bonfires were a part of that tradition. You didn't just leave them alone. Even she knew that. "Maria," Hannah called again. A voice came from the fire. "Hannah, I'm here." Hannah jerked back, her eyes narrowing. She slowly approached the fire. The heat radiated across the clearing, grass browning and curling under its base, the air impossibly warm. Sweat pricked Hannah's skin as she moved closer, squinting to make out the shape inside the flames. There. It was a person. Not much bigger than Hannah. They glowed blindingly white, like the magnesium ribbons their father had burned for them in the lab. "Maria?" The shape in the fire started crying. "Hannah, I don't know what to do. I saw a bear and I got scared. And then I was on fire and I don't know how to stop it. I don't know what to do." "It's okay." Hannah reached out, certain that if Maria was safe in there, she would be too. "Stop!" Maria snapped. "I don't want to burn you." Hannah recoiled, the heat of the fire finally registering as something that could hurt her. Her skin grew dry and tight, the sweat evaporating as soon as it appeared, and she couldn't imagine how much hotter it was in the center. Maria could die. "Help! Father!" Hannah shrieked. They had to do something. "Hannah, stay back!" Hannah turned to see their father, Artem, entering the clearing, tall and broad and strong. Hannah felt something inside her loosen. Everything would be all right. He could fix it. Artem knelt next to Hannah, his large hand on her shoulder. "Maria, can you hear me?" Maria's shape seemed to nod. "Uh-huh." "Good. This is nothing to fear. Your powers have emerged." "But I don't know how to stop them." "Listen to me," Artem said, his voice calm. He stared at the fire, and Hannah stared up at him. "Take a deep breath. Can you do that?" He heard Maria inhale within the fire, her breath wet with tears. "Good. You're doing so well. Now, breathe again." Maria took another breath, then another. Her sobbing slowed and her breathing grew steady. The flames died down around her, leaving a slim, blonde girl standing naked in the woods, a scorched circle of earth at her feet. Artem took off his shirt and wrapped it around Maria. "Good girl. I'm proud of you." He wrapped her in a hug, and Hannah saw Maria stiffen. Their father wasn't usually the hugging sort. He was the sort to watch while the lab techs took samples and ran tests, taking meticulous notes of everything they found. He pulled back and looked into Maria's watery eyes, father and daughter, like reflections of their white blonde hair and ice blue eyes. "Want to go back to the cabin? Maxim is going to be so jealous when you tell him." Maria nodded, a small giggle falling out. She clapped her hands over her mouth as if she could put it back in. Artem smiled and stood. "You're a proper super now." He started walking toward their cabin. Hannah looked at Maria. Her skin was pale, and the area under her eyes was darkening. Her pale brows furrowed as her mind ticked away. Hannah flashed her a grin. "You have powers," she whispered. Maria nodded. Hannah thought of what their brothers, Maxim and Tomas, would say. Max would be impatient for his own powers now, since he was only a year younger than Maria. As twins, maybe Hannah and Tomas would have a competition to see whose powers would manifest first. Hannah wondered what her own powers would be when they arrived. She skipped up to Artem and put her arm around his. It was the 1 week of the year when Artem took a break from his research, and yet Hannah found herself eager to go back to the lab, to see the changes that had taken place in Maria's body. Artem looked down at her and gave her a knowing, close-lipped smile. "One day, it'll be your turn." She couldn't wait. 1. 8 years later, Hannah was sick of waiting. She slouched at one of the terminals in Artem's underground lab, scrolling through the SHR, the superhuman registry, while she waited for the samples in her petri dishes to mature. The lab was built like a Cold War bunker, an operating room, a specimen room, a laboratory, and a handful of training rooms with all concrete floors and stainless steel surfaces. They were dug into the earth and lit with fluorescent lights. While the world above ground might be filled with color and life and mess, the lab was kept calm and sterile, a place where everything could be clearly examined, labeled, and put in its place. The only sounds were the faint hum of the air vents, the beeps of the sequencing machines as they processed DNA samples, and Artem typing away at another one of the terminals while Hannah scrolled. With every tap, she struggled not to flinch. Other than a nod of acknowledgement when he entered the lab, he hadn't spoken to her today, as was his M.O. The pattern would continue until she did something wrong. Then he would stand over her work, his arms crossed and his lips thin, and Hannah would turn into a blushing, fumbling mess. She continued scrolling, the listed names blurring together. Hannah could never untangle her feelings when Artem was in the lab. Sometimes she wanted him there. She wanted him to see when she finally had the breakthrough that would change everything. The one that would prove her worth as a scientist, even if she had none as a super. But when her father was in the room, always listening, she couldn't relax. Her hands shook. She muddled up chemicals, missed steps in the process, and could never pinpoint what exactly had gone wrong. If only her family could be as clean and clear-cut as her experiments. As Hannah scrolled, she looked to see if any new supers had been registered since she had last checked. Specifically, any new supers who didn't have powers. Such a search would have been unthinkable just a few years before. Even though they'd always had unlimited access to the registry, a rare privilege if you didn't work in law enforcement, but granted to Artem Super as the world's leading specialist in the super gene mutation. Supers weren't outed until their powers emerged. There would have been no reason to generate a genetic profile for the registry if someone wasn't presenting with powers. That had changed 3 years ago when, after years of campaigning, Artem had successfully gotten new legislation passed for more widespread genetic profiling, which would allow researchers and the government to better understand the prevalence of the mutation in the wider population and potentially identifying new supers. Now, the DNA of anyone who had any blood work done, anyone who underwent surgery, even anyone who used one of those online ancestry sites, was sent to Super Technologies Incorporated for testing and, if the mutation was found, addition to the SHR. Hannah had even heard that the police had started performing random swab tests to claim the reward that came with discovering new supers, though it had been almost 2 years since she last left the complex, so she couldn't say whether these rumors were true. So, every couple of weeks, when Hannah was waiting for test tubes to spin down or samples to dry in the fumes hood, she scrolled through the SHR to find anyone who presented with the supergene mutation whose powers hadn't yet manifested. With fewer than 300 names to get through, it never took her long to confirm that there was only ever one. Hannah Super, age 16, hair, brown, eyes, brown, gene present, yes, power, unknown. In a sea of teenagers and adults who could vanish at will, shoot lightning from their palms, and deafen people with their voices, Hannah was the only one who'd reached the age of 16 without any noticeable powers. At first, everyone had assumed that they were still coming. Maybe she was a late bloomer. Then, Hannah had theorized that there must be other supers without powers. But there had been no reason to analyze their DNA without an emergence incident. Now, though, with no other powerless supers in sight, Hannah wondered whether it was time to resign herself to the fact that she was fundamentally flawed. Her alarm beeped and she straightened, anticipating fizzing in her chest. She closed the SHR and shot a furtive look at Artem over her shoulder. But he was still focused on his own terminal. Perfect. She could call him over if it worked. While Artem might be the world's leading authority on the mutation, one puzzle he hadn't cracked was how to separate superpowers from supers. Or better yet, how those without the mutation could gain powers. But Hannah had a theory. They knew splicing didn't work, nor did introducing mutated DNA in the form of a virus, nor did breeding supers with normals, though there was some evidence the mutation was recessive. Hannah's mother had been a super after all. But it might be possible through transfection, where a cell, with some encouragement, absorbed foreign DNA from its environment. If she managed it, she would have achieved something even Artem hadn't done. Hannah set up her workstation. A tray with 5 petri dishes, a clean microscope, and her notepad. Then she stretched some surgical gloves over her hands. She gingerly slid the petri dish under the microscope and looked through the lens. The bacteria, dyed with methylene blue, danced across the sea, magnified 1,000 times. Hannah's shoulders relaxed as she became absorbed in their intricate ballet, their color shockingly bright compared to the lab. She zoomed in to inspect the bacteria on a cellular level. There. She held her breath as she adjusted the zoom again. She'd done it. She'd transfected Maria's DNA into the bacteria. Her mind raced at the possibilities. If bacteria were able to accept plasmids with the super gene mutation, what did that mean for people who didn't have superpowers? Would it be possible to create a world where everyone was a super? Where everyone was gifted like her brothers and sisters? Would a plasmid taken from a functional super be enough to compensate for her own dysfunctional DNA? Hannah slid the second dish under the microscope. The third. The fourth. The bacteria had all successfully absorbed the super gene mutation. Hannah gave a silent whoop, punching the air in glee. As she swung her arms, her fist clipped the edge of the chemical shelf, and 3 bottles tumbled off the edge. Hannah's mouth dropped open. She reached out as the bottles fell, almost in slow motion, then shattered against the worktop. Glass shattered across the steel and onto the floor as a sea of liquid, clear, blue, and yellow washed over her work. Hannah groaned, dropping her head into her hands. Weeks of work gone. She didn't even have any spare cultures left in the fridge. Hannah sighed and looked up at the mess once more. One of the petri dishes was on fire. Ugh! Hannah yelped. She tore off her lab coat and put it over the dish, suffocating the flame. What on earth are you doing? Her hands still on the coat, Hannah turned around. Artem was standing behind her, intimidatingly large in his black turtleneck and white lab coat. Maria had once joked that he had designed the complex with undersized door frames so that he could look bigger, but Hannah disagreed. Artem was tall and broad, and the size of their door frames wasn't going to change that. My experiment took an unexpected turn. Artem watched her, his eyes cold. Clean it up. He left the room. Hannah turned back to her stained, soaked lab coat. Heat flooded her cheeks. She'd been so close. She'd actually done something right, something that she could replicate. It was something that she knew he'd be, if not proud of, at least interested in. Yet she'd managed to screw it up before she could share the results. It would be days before she could do it again, if he let her use the lab after this. Hannah blinked back frustrated tears as she wadded up her coat and threw it in the bin. She left her gloves on, even though they were sticky with sweat, while she wiped down the bench and swept up the glass. Then she turned to what was left of her petri dish, all of them ruined, one of them blackened. She inspected the burnt dish, trying to recall the contents of the bottles she'd knocked over. There was no reason why any of them would spontaneously burst into flames, even if the chemicals inside them had mixed. Neither she nor Artem would have been so careless in their organization. But if that were the case, what had happened? She reflected on everything she'd done to cultivate the bacteria. From when she'd taken Maria's sample, Hannah paused mid-thought. That was it. Hannah broke into a smile as the pieces fell into place. She, of all people, knew that the supergene mutation wasn't alone enough to cause superpowers to emerge. They needed to be triggered. In most cases, the trigger event seemed to be connected to the stress response, though they hadn't been able to nail down the exact chemical formula. Hannah might have done it, though. Chemicals hadn't spontaneously combusted. They had triggered the latent powers in the transfected DNA. Maria's powers. She had to tell Artem. Hannah kicked off her lab slippers and ran up the steel stairs to Artem's library, punching in the access code and letting the lens scan her retina so that she could enter the main house. She pushed open the bookcase to see Artem sitting at his desk, his phone to his ear and paperwork spread over the surface before him. Minister, the challenge is that most supers aren't trained in effective use of their powers. If they were, there wouldn't be so many accidents, and there wouldn't be the same fear among the rest of the population. We monitor and restrict them to protect the wider population. It's why they're barred from certain professions and aren't admitted into certain venues. Artem paused while the person on the other end of the line spoke. Hannah stood in front of him, though his eyes didn't register her presence. He looked straight ahead, his gaze seeming to pass through her midsection as he focused on the call. She found herself swaying forward on her toes and back again as she tried to contain her excitement. And what exactly are the Russians doing? Artem asked. At the other person's response, he gave a wry smile. Good luck to them, then. I can't see it ending well. Yes, there are defense applications to these powers, but it takes time and training. Take my children as a case study. A well-oiled tactical team with complete control of their abilities and the understanding of how to put them to the best use. I'm not saying it is impossible to scale, but we would need to consider which abilities are most appropriate and then put the individuals concerned through training like any member of the armed forces. Hana frowned thoughtfully as Artem paused once more. He had always pushed her siblings to be above reproach, to be an example of what supers could be. While other supers lived in hiding, never revealing their abilities unless they were forced to, Hana's siblings gave press conferences and appeared on the news, ready to serve whenever the authorities called. Hana hadn't thought of them as a test case for military applications, though. Artem gave a real laugh this time. It's certainly food for thought. Thank you for your time, Minister. He set his phone down and turned back to his papers without lifting his eyes. Yes? Hana took a deep breath. I think I found a way to trigger a superhuman response outside of a super's body. Artem's head snapped up. Really? Hana nodded, biting her lip to hold back her grin. This was the moment that she'd been waiting for over 2 years, since he'd given up hope of her ever getting powers of her own. I used a sample from Maria. That's why the petri dish caught on fire. Artem leaned forward, his brow furrowed. And how? An alarm blared through the speaker in the ceiling. Hana winced at the sound. Her father stood, his forehead smooth, his jaw set. Get your siblings. We'll discuss this when I return.